This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 14. The Downfall of Sejanus. At some point after Gaius turned 19, on August 30th, 31, he was invited to live with Tiberius on the island of Capri. Gaius's brother, Nero, was not so fortunate. While he was still in exile on the island of Pontia, an imperial squad arrived to execute him. Instead, Nero committed suicide. His brother Drusus was still imprisoned on the Palatine Hill. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, had committed suicide by refusing to eat. The one-eyed woman, beaten and exiled at Tiberius's command, had been reduced to starving herself. This was a tremendous fall for the wife of Germanicus and for the hope from decades ago that their young family represented for the future. Now, Gaius, the sole living son of Germanicus and Agrippina, who was not imprisoned, was living with the man, the emperor himself, who had both his mother and his brother killed. Gaius held his tongue, and even when induced to say negative things about Tiberius, he would decline. Gaius also had three sisters, Julia Agrippina, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, who, as young children, were deeply scarred by the death of their mother and brothers, not to mention the death of their father Germanicus years earlier. The teenage Agrippina had already secured her own protection through marriage to her cousin, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. Her younger sisters would be looking for protection through marriage too. In the meantime, they lived with their grandmother and heard lively and courageous family stories about Augustus, Antonia, Julia, Germanicus, and their own mother, Agrippina. Of course, their very names, Julia, also harken back to prominent family lines. That same year, in 31, Tiberius finally gave permission for Sejanus to marry Claudia Livilla, daughter of Antonia Minor. Recall that Claudia Livilla was a sister to Germanicus, and she had been married to Tiberius' son Drusus. Sejanus and Claudia Livilla had an affair while Drusus was still alive, and together they conspired to have him poisoned to death, and Tiberius never learned the truth of that story. Tiberius was only distraught at the death of his son Drusus. So now, with Sejanus having secured permission from Tiberius to marry Claudia Livilla, Sejanus must certainly have felt that his position was secure. Senators flocked to him for favors. His statues were already placed throughout the city, his birthday was celebrated as a holiday, and the emperor was still on the island of Capri, where he had essentially been for the past 5 years. However, Livilla's mother, Antonia Minor, was unimpressed and saw Sejanus' growing power as a threat to Tiberius. Moreover, Antonia Minor, the mother of Germanicus, had been friendly with her daughter-in-law Agrippina the Elder and her grandchildren. Antonia had welcomed them into her home, where they had lived for a time. So, upset with Sejanus in his treatment of Germanicus and Agrippina's family, Antonia now decided to make an exception to her own rule that she stay out of politics. She employed her female servant Canis and dictated a letter to the emperor outlining her concerns and claims that Sejanus was plotting against Tiberius. Canis dutifully wrote the text and sent it via Antonia's freedman Pallas. That Canis could write is a strong testament to her intelligence, especially as a servant. Not many people in the ancient world were literate, and those that were more likely to be men. Canis would eventually gain her freedom and carry on a close relationship with Vespasian, a Roman general who became emperor decades later. The story will pick up in a future episode. But when Tiberius read Antonia's letter, he was angry. And this came around the time that Apicata, Sejanus' first wife, also wrote a letter to Tiberius, claiming that Sejanus and Livilla poisoned Drusus, Tiberius' son, and Livilla's former husband years earlier with the help of Lygdus, the eunuch cupbearer, and Eudemus, Livilla's physician. Upon hearing these accusations, Tiberius had both Ligdus and Eudemus tortured to extract a confirmation of these allegations. He then composed a letter to the Senate ordering Sejanus to be executed without a trial, and he made sure to have Livilla arrested. But Tiberius was still on Capri, and he needed someone trustworthy for this task. So he tapped Macro, who was Rome's fire chief, the prefect vigilum, who happened to be at Capri with his young wife Ennia. Ennia was the granddaughter of the astrologer Thrasyllus, who was also on the island as a friend and guest of Tiberius. Tiberius was in the habit of keeping the Senate on their toes. He would write cryptic letters, which were not always clear, so the Senate was often unsure of how to interpret Tiberius's words. This time, when he composed the letter demanding Sejanus's death, he made sure that Macro would know how to execute the plans contained therein, and for that, he would give Macro the office of Praetorian Prefect, which was currently held by Sejanus. So on October 18th, 31, Macro came to Rome with the letter along with the other letters to influential and prominent members of the Senate, the consul Regulus and the prefect Vigiles Laco. Sejanus was immediately alerted to Macro's arrival, but Macro assured him that he was there because the Senate was bestowing on Sejanus special honors. Macro also dismissed the Praetorian Guard and sent them back to their camp, so that Laco's men could keep watch instead. The Senate summoned Sejanus to the Temple of Apollo near the Palatine for the reading of this most recent letter from Tiberius. Macro gave them the letter and then departed for the Praetorian camp, for those soldiers were becoming fidgety, knowing that Laco's men were in positions that they were meant to hold. As the letter began to be proclaimed out loud, it started with praises for Sejanus and the bestowal of additional powers. Many senators congratulated him, but as they continued to read from the letter, the Senate building became surrounded by Laco's men. The letter then turned to denunciations of Sejanus, before ordering his very arrest. Sejanus was taken immediately to the Tullianum, Rome's prison near the Capitoline Hill. About this time, the Praetorian Guard grew mutinous and began plundering and burning the suburbs. Macro calmed them down with promises of cash, a simple bribe, and let them know that he would be their new prefect rather than Sejanus. Later that evening, at Macro's instigation and based on Tiberius's letter, the Senate voted to execute Sejanus. He was strangled to death only moments thereafter, and his body tossed down the Gemonian stairs, which led from the top of the Capitoline Hill down to the Roman Forum. In Republican times, criminals and others convicted of capital offenses were thrown down from the 80-foot-high Tarpeian Rock, also atop the Capitoline Hill, to their death as their bodies were left for wild dogs before being thrown into the Tiber. Being flung from the Tarpeian Rock or thrown down the Gemonian stairs was simply added shame and public humiliation. Sejanus's body lay at the foot of the stairs for 3 days while it was defiled by the public before being thrown into the Tiber. Less than a week later, Macro made sure that Sejanus's oldest son, Strabo, was arrested and executed. Apicata committed suicide 2 days after that. Sejanus's other children were executed in December of that year as well: Capito, Aelianus, and Junilla. Junilla happened to be a virgin, and there were laws against executing virgins. To overcome that, she was raped while a rope was tied around her neck, and then she was executed. Others were swept up in the conspiracy as well, including Titus Ollius, who was married to Poppaea Sabina, one of the most beautiful women in Rome. Together, they had a baby girl the year before in Pompeii. She was known as Ollia. She and her mother will show up in future episodes. Titus Ollius, however, knew his end was near, so he committed suicide. The Senate voted damnatio memoriae of Livilla, the first woman to be so proclaimed, as well as Sejanus and many others associated with him. Damnatio memoriae simply meant a damnation of memory. All indications of them having lived would be removed. Livilla's fall from grace was therefore profound. The sister of Germanicus and Claudius had engaged in a plot to have her own husband killed so she could marry Sejanus, who was not even of a prominent family. The Senate certainly determined that damnatio memoriae was warranted. This was the gravest punishment the Senate could inflict, as it meant that the memory of the dead was condemned. All references to such persons were exculpated from Roman history, texts, monuments, and more. All the statues of Sejanus, who was so recently celebrated by the Senate, were destroyed. And because of this, Julia Livilla, the youngest daughter of Germanicus and Agrippina, who had been born on the island of Lesbos, also ceased referring to herself by that name, and instead she became known simply as Julia. She and her sisters, Julia Drusilla and Julia Agrippina, were still alive. Next time, we'll turn our attention back to Judea and learn about the death of John the Baptist, and then we'll check in on Tiberius on his island of Capri.